The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh glare on the greasy surface of the table I was wiping down for the third time tonight. My lower back ached with that familiar throb that came from 10 hours on my feet, serving coffee and eggs to truckers, night shift workers, and the occasional lost soul who wandered into Murphy's diner, looking for something they probably wouldn't find in our stale pie case. The coffee maker gurgled behind me, a constant companion through these endless nights. Steam rose from its glass pot, carrying the bitter aroma that had long since stopped being comforting and now just reminded me of how many more hours I had until dawn. My reflection in the window showed tired eyes and hair that had given up any pretense of styling hours ago, pulled back into a messy bun, secured with whatever elastic band I could find. I pressed my hand briefly to my still flat stomach, a gesture that was becoming habitual even though it was far too early for anyone to notice. 3 weeks. That's how long I'd known about the life growing inside me, and every shift felt like a countdown to a future I couldn't yet wrap my mind around. The father was long gone, disappeared after our brief affair with promises to call that had evaporated like steam from his coffee cup. "Grace, table 12 needs their check," called Marge from behind the counter, her voice cutting through my thoughts. She was the night manager, a woman in her 50s who'd seen everything Murphy's had to offer and wasn't impressed by any of it. Her graying hair was teased into a style that belonged to a different decade, and her makeup was applied with the precision of someone who'd been doing it the same way for 30 years. I nodded, tucking the damp rag into my apron pocket and reaching for the black leather folder containing Table 12's bill. As I approached their booth, the 2 construction workers were already standing, hard hats tucked under their arms and work boots scraping against the worn linoleum floor. "Thanks, hun," the older one said, pressing a $5 bill into my hand along with the payment for their meal. It wasn't much, but every dollar counted now more than ever. I watched them head toward the door, their heavy footsteps echoing in the nearly empty diner. It was then that I saw it. Left behind on the red vinyl seat of their booth was a wallet. Not the cheap canvas or worn leather variety that most of our customers carried, but something different entirely. Rich, dark leather that caught the light with the kind of polish that spoke of money, real money. The kind of wallet that probably cost more than I made in a week. I glanced around the diner. The construction workers were already gone, their truck pulling out of the parking lot with a rumble of diesel engine. Marge was busy with inventory behind the counter, counting packets of sugar with the meticulous attention of someone who'd learned that every penny mattered. The only other customer was Frank, a regular who came in every night around 2 a.m. for coffee and a slice of whatever pie hadn't sold during the day. He was absorbed in his newspaper, glasses perched on the end of his nose. Picking up the wallet, I was struck by its weight. The leather was butter soft, and embossed discreetly near the bottom corner were initials: GR. Inside, I found what I expected to find in a wallet belonging to someone with money. Crisp $100 bills, several credit cards with prestigious names, and a driver's license that made my breath catch in my throat. Gabrielle Russo. The address was in the hills, the exclusive part of town where houses had gates and views of the city. But it wasn't the address that made my hands tremble slightly as I held the license. It was the name. Everyone in the city knew that name, though most people were smart enough not to say it too loudly. Gabriel Russo wasn't just rich. He was connected. The kind of connected that meant people didn't ask too many questions about his business dealings, and those who did sometimes found themselves with problems they hadn't had before. My first instinct was to turn the wallet over to Marge and let her deal with it. That would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But as I stood there in the fluorescent-lit booth, wallet heavy in my hands, I thought about the bills in my purse that were already overdue, the rent that was coming up in 2 weeks, and the doctor's appointment I'd been putting off because I couldn't afford it. There had to be at least $2,000 in cash in this wallet, more money than I'd ever held at one time. It would be so easy to slip it into my apron, tell Marge that the construction workers hadn't left anything behind. By the time Gabriel Russo realized his wallet was missing, I could be long gone, on a bus to another city with enough money to start fresh somewhere else. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew I couldn't do it. My mother had raised me better than that, even if she'd died when I was 17 and left me to figure out the rest of life on my own. She'd always said that integrity was the one thing nobody could take from you, and the only thing you could never get back once you'd given it away. With a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in my chest, I pulled out my phone and dialed the number listed on one of the business cards tucked behind Gabrielle Russo's driver's license. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I was beginning to think it would go to voicemail when a voice answered, smooth and deep, with just a hint of an accent that made my name sound different when he spoke it. "This is Gabriel." I took a breath, suddenly nervous in a way that had nothing to do with late-night exhaustion. "Mr. Russo, this is Grace Chen. I work at Murphy's Diner on 5th Street. You left your wallet here tonight." There was a pause, long enough that I wondered if the connection had been lost. When he spoke again, there was something different in his voice, a note of surprise that seemed genuine. "You found my wallet." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes, sir, in one of the booths. I have it here safe." Another pause. In the background, I could hear what sounded like music, something classical and expensive. "And you called to return it?" Again, not quite a question, but there was something in the way he said it that made me defensive. "Of course I called. It's your wallet." "Of course." Now there was definitely amusement in his voice, as if I'd said something unexpectedly entertaining. "Tell me, Grace from Murphy's Diner, do you often work this late?" The question caught me off guard. I glanced at the clock above the counter. 2:30 in the morning. "I work the night shift. Yes, sir." "And you're there now? At the diner?" "Yes, sir. Until 6 a.m. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at my phone for a moment, processing what had just happened. Gabriel Russo was coming here, to Murphy's Diner, at almost 3 in the morning, to collect his wallet from a waitress he'd never met. I should have felt relieved that I'd be able to return it and put this whole situation behind me. Instead, I felt a flutter of nervousness that had nothing to do with being pregnant, and everything to do with the fact that I was about to meet one of the most dangerous men in the city. I tucked the wallet safely into my apron pocket and tried to go back to my normal routine. I refilled Frank's coffee, wiped down already clean tables, and straightened the sugar packets that Marge had already counted twice. But my eyes kept drifting to the front windows, watching for headlights in the parking lot. Marge noticed my distraction when I accidentally poured salt instead of sugar into the coffee maker. "What's got you so jumpy tonight?" she asked, eyeing me with the suspicious look she usually reserved for customers who tried to dine and dash. "Nothing," I lied, dumping out the ruined coffee and starting fresh. "Just tired." She snorted, a sound that conveyed years of dealing with 20-something waitresses and their problems. "You're always tired. This is different. You pregnant or something?" The question hit so close to the truth that I nearly dropped the coffee pot. "What? No. Why would you even ask that?" Marge shrugged, returning to her inventory sheets. "Just asking. You've been looking green around the gills lately, and you've been eating those saltines like they're going out of style." I forced a laugh, hoping it sounded more convincing than it felt. "It's just the late shifts. They mess with your stomach." Before Marge could respond, the bell above the front door chimed, and I felt the temperature in the diner drop by 10 degrees. Not literally, of course, but there was something about the man who walked through the door that seemed to change the very atmosphere of the room. Gabriel Russo was taller than I'd expected, probably 6'2" or 6'3", with the kind of presence that made him seem even larger. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the late hour, and he wore a black wool coat that probably cost more than my car. But it was his eyes that caught my attention, dark and intelligent, scanning the diner with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly. Those eyes found mine across the restaurant, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The fluorescent lights, the smell of coffee and grease, the soft snoring coming from Frank's corner booth. There was just this man, looking at me with an intensity that made my heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He approached the counter where I stood, frozen, and I noticed that he moved with a fluid grace that suggested controlled power. When he spoke, his voice was the same smooth baritone I'd heard on the phone, but hearing it in person sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. Grace. He made my name sound like something precious, the way other people might say diamond or gold. I managed to find my voice, though it came out smaller than I'd intended. Mr. Russo, thank you for coming. A slight smile curved his lips, transforming his entire face. Where moments before he'd looked dangerous and untouchable, now he simply looked like an incredibly handsome man who was genuinely pleased to meet me. Thank you for calling, he replied, his accent adding an exotic note to the simple words. In my experience, most people wouldn't have. I reached into my apron pocket and withdrew his wallet, setting it carefully on the counter between us. Most people aren't raised right, I guess. His smile widened at that, and he picked up the wallet, checking its contents briefly before sliding it into the inside pocket of his coat. Everything's here. Of course it is. Of course. He studied me for a moment, taking in my tired face, my wrinkled uniform, the way I kept unconsciously touching my stomach. You work here every night? I nodded, suddenly self-conscious about my appearance. Standing this close to him, I was acutely aware of the contrast between his obvious wealth and my decidedly modest circumstances. His watch alone probably cost more than I made in 6 months. 5 nights a week, I said. Tuesday through Saturday. And you like it? Working the night shift? It was an odd question, especially coming from someone like him. I couldn't imagine Gabrielle Russo caring about the job satisfaction of a diner waitress. It pays the bills, I said simply. Something flickered in his dark eyes, an emotion I couldn't quite identify. I'm sure it does. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a $100 bill, placing it on the counter. For your honesty. I stared at the money, torn between pride and practicality. $100 would cover my electric bill and still leave enough for groceries. But accepting it felt wrong somehow, like I'd be crossing a line I wasn't ready to cross. That's not necessary, I said, pushing the bill back toward him. I was just doing the right thing. He made no move to take the money back. In my world, Grace, doing the right thing is rare enough to be worth rewarding. What world is that? The question slipped out before I could stop it, and I immediately regretted it. His expression shifted subtly, the warmth in his eyes cooling slightly as he was reminded of who he was and what he represented. A complicated one, he said after a moment, full of people who would have kept that wallet without a second thought. Then maybe you need to find better people. The words were out before I could stop them, bold and presumptuous in a way that would have horrified me if I'd had time to think about them first. But instead of being offended, Gabrielle Russo threw back his head and laughed, a rich, genuine sound that transformed his entire demeanor once again. Maybe I do, he agreed, his eyes bright with amusement. Tell me, Grace, are you always this direct with your customers? You're not exactly a customer, I pointed out. You didn't order anything. No, he said thoughtfully. I suppose I didn't. Perhaps I should remedy that. We're not exactly fine dining, I warned him, gesturing around the tired diner with its worn booths and faded linoleum. The coffee's decent, and the pie's not bad if you don't mind that it's been sitting out for a while. What would you recommend? I blinked at him, surprised by the question. You're serious? Completely serious. I considered this, looking at this man in his expensive coat and $1,000 watch, asking for menu recommendations from a diner that probably served its best days sometime in the 1980s. The apple pie, I said finally. It's Marge's mother's recipe, and it's actually pretty good. Then I'll have the apple pie, and coffee, if you think it's decent. I found myself smiling despite everything. Coming right up, as I moved to prepare his order, I was acutely aware of his eyes following my movements. It wasn't an uncomfortable feeling exactly, more like being in the spotlight of someone's complete attention. When I placed the plate and coffee cup in front of him, our fingers brushed briefly, and I felt an electric shock that had nothing to do with static electricity. "Aren't you going to ask me to pay first?" he asked, taking a bite of the pie. "Should I be worried about you skipping out on the check?" Another laugh, softer this time. "No, I don't think you should be worried about that." He ate the pie slowly, savoring each bite in a way that suggested he genuinely enjoyed it. I busied myself with other tasks, but I kept finding excuses to pass by his section of the counter. Each time, I caught him watching me with those dark, intelligent eyes. "Good pie," he said when he'd finished. "I'll tell Marge you said so." He reached for his wallet again, but I held up a hand to stop him. "It's on the house. Consider it a thank you for coming all the way down here in the middle of the night. You don't need to do that. I want to." He studied me for a long moment, and I had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing far more than I was comfortable revealing. "What time do you get off work?" The question caught me off guard. 6 a.m.? Why?" "I'd like to take you to breakfast." I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry. What?" "Breakfast," he repeated calmly. "There's a place I know that makes excellent eggs Benedict. I think you'd enjoy it." "Mr. Russo, I don't think—" "Gabriel," he corrected gently. "And before you say no, consider this. When was the last time someone offered to buy you breakfast somewhere that doesn't serve it off a griddle that's older than you are?" He had a point. I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten at a restaurant where I wasn't the one serving the food. But accepting his invitation felt dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with his reputation, and everything to do with the way he made my pulse race when he looked at me. "I'm not really dressed for anywhere fancy," I said, gesturing to my uniform. "You look perfect," he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made my cheeks warm. I found myself wavering, caught between caution and curiosity. This man was dangerous. Everyone knew that. But he was also offering me something I hadn't experienced in longer than I cared to admit. Attention from someone who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. "Why?" I asked finally. "Why what?" "Why do you want to take me to breakfast? You don't know anything about me." "I know you're honest," he said. "I know you work hard. I know you have beautiful eyes and a smile that could light up this entire diner." He paused, his gaze intense. "And I know that I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since you called me tonight." My heart skipped a beat at his words, but I forced myself to stay practical. "You don't even know my last name." "Grace Chen," he said without hesitation. 24 years old, lives on Maple Street in a one-bedroom apartment above Mrs. Patterson's flower shop. You've been working at Murphy's for 8 months, and before that, you worked at a coffee shop downtown that closed when the owner retired. I felt the blood drain from my face. "How do you know all that?" "I make it my business to know things," he said matter-of-factly, "especially about people who interest me." "You had me investigated?" My voice came out sharper than I'd intended, and I saw Marge look up from her paperwork with interest. "I had you verified," Gabriel corrected smoothly. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "There is." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a tone that was almost intimate, despite the public setting. "Grace, in my position, I can't afford to take chances with people I don't know. But what I learned about you only confirmed what I already suspected. Which is that you're exactly as genuine as you seem." He sat back, his expression softening. So what do you say? Will you let me buy you breakfast? I looked into his dark eyes, seeing something there that I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't just interest, though that was certainly present. It was something deeper, more complex, as if this successful, powerful man was asking for something more significant than just a breakfast date. Okay, I heard myself say, surprising us both, but somewhere normal. I'm not ready for anywhere that requires reservations. His smile was brilliant. I know just the place. By the time 6 a.m. arrived, I had worked myself into a state of nervous anticipation that made my hands shake as I hung up my apron. Gabriel had left around 4, promising to return when my shift ended, and I'd spent the intervening 2 hours second-guessing my decision to accept his invitation. Marge had noticed my distraction, making several pointed comments about rich men who don't have any business in places like this, but she'd stopped short of directly questioning me about Gabriel's visit. I used the employee bathroom to freshen up as much as possible, splashing cold water on my face and running my fingers through my hair in an attempt to tame the worst of the damage from my long shift. My reflection in the cracked mirror showed tired eyes and pale skin, but there wasn't much I could do about that. I'd learned long ago that makeup was a luxury I couldn't afford, and even if I could, I wouldn't have known how to apply it properly. Frank was still in his corner booth when I emerged, reading a different section of his newspaper and nursing what had to be his 6th cup of coffee. He'd been coming to Murphy's every night for as long as I'd worked there, always arriving around 2 a.m. and staying until well past dawn. He was a thin man in his 60s with graying hair and clothes that had seen better days, but his eyes were kind, and he always left a decent tip, despite obviously being on a fixed income. "You're looking nervous tonight, Grace," he observed as I passed his table. "Just tired," I said automatically, the same response I'd given Marge earlier. Frank folded his newspaper and fixed me with a look that was far too perceptive for comfort. "I've been coming here for 12 years, he said quietly. "I've seen a lot of young women work the night shift, and I've seen what happens when they start getting mixed up with the wrong kind of men." I felt my cheeks flush. "I don't know what you mean." "That man who was here earlier," Frank continued as if I hadn't spoken. "Gabriel Russo. I know who he is, Grace. Most people in this city do." I glanced toward the kitchen, making sure Marge wasn't within earshot. "He just came to pick up his wallet, that's all." "Is it?" Frank's expression was gentle but concerned, because from where I was sitting, it looked like he was a lot more interested in you than he was in retrieving his property. I wanted to deny it, to brush off Frank's concerns as the paranoid worries of an old man who spent too much time reading newspapers and not enough time living in the real world. But I couldn't quite bring myself to lie to him. Frank had always been kind to me, treating me with the sort of grandfatherly concern that I'd missed since my mother died. "He asked me to breakfast," I admitted quietly. Frank's expression grew even more serious. "Grace, I'm going to say something, and I want you to really listen to me. Men like Gabriel Russo don't ask waitresses to breakfast because they're interested in conversation. What's that supposed to mean?" "It means he sees something in you that he wants," Frank said bluntly. "And men like him are used to getting what they want, one way or another." Before I could respond, the bell above the front door chimed, and Gabriel walked in. He'd changed clothes since his earlier visit, trading his black wool coat for a charcoal gray suit that fit him like it had been made specifically for his body, which, given his obvious wealth, it probably had been. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and he moved with the same controlled grace I'd noticed before. Our eyes met across the diner, and he smiled, transforming his entire face with warmth that made my heart skip a beat. Whatever Frank had been trying to warn me about seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of that smile. "Ready?" Gabriel asked as he approached the counter. I nodded, suddenly tongue-tied in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. "Let me just get my purse." As I retrieved my bag from behind the counter, I felt Frank's eyes on me. When I glanced his way, he gave me a small, sad smile and shook his head slightly. Not in disapproval, exactly, but with the resigned acceptance of someone who'd seen this story play out before and knew how it was likely to end. Gabriel placed a hand lightly on the small of my back as he guided me toward the door, a gesture that was both protective and possessive. I could feel the warmth of his palm through the thin fabric of my uniform, and it sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. The morning air was crisp and clean after the stale atmosphere of the diner, carrying the scent of dew and early blooming flowers. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that made even the shabby neighborhood around Murphy's look almost beautiful. A black sedan was parked at the curb, sleek and expensive looking, with tinted windows that made it impossible to see inside. A man in a dark suit stood beside it, his posture alert and professional. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of build that suggested he spent serious time in the gym, and his eyes swept the street constantly, never settling on any one thing for more than a few seconds. "Vincent," Gabriel said by way of introduction as we approached the car. "This is Grace." Vincent nodded politely, but I caught the way his eyes assessed me, cataloging everything from my discount uniform to my scuffed shoes. It wasn't hostile, exactly, but it wasn't entirely friendly either. "Ma'am," he said, opening the rear door of the sedan. The interior of the car was as luxurious as I'd expected, with leather seats that were buttery soft and ambient lighting that cast everything in a warm, golden glow. Gabriel settled beside me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made me want to lean closer. "Where are we going?" I asked, as Vincent pulled smoothly away from the curb. "A place called Café Luna," Gabriel replied. "It's quiet, and they make excellent coffee." I nodded, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. Through the tinted windows, I watched the neighborhood change as we drove, the rundown buildings and empty lots gradually giving way to tree-lined streets and well-maintained storefronts. This was a part of the city I rarely saw, where people lived who didn't have to work night shifts to make ends meet. "Nervous?" Gabriel asked, and I realized I'd been fidgeting with the strap of my purse. "A little," I admitted. "I don't usually do this." "Do what?" "Go to breakfast with men I barely know." "What do you usually do?" I considered the question, thinking about my routine over the past 8 months since I'd started working at Murphy's. Go home, shower, sleep until 3 in the afternoon, then get up and do it all over again. That sounds lonely. His observation was more accurate than I cared to admit. Since moving to the city, I'd struggled to make friends or maintain any kind of social life. The night shift made normal relationships difficult, and the constant worry about money left little energy for pursuing connections with other people. "I'm used to it," I said, which wasn't quite the same as saying I liked it. "Being alone doesn't mean you have to stay alone," Gabriel said quietly. Before I could respond to that loaded statement, Vincent was pulling up in front of a small cafe with ivy-covered walls and cheerful yellow awnings. It looked exactly like the kind of place I'd always imagined eating at, but never had the money to try. Inside, Café Luna was warm and inviting, with exposed brick walls, fresh flowers on every table, and the rich aroma of really good coffee filling the air. The other patrons were well-dressed professionals grabbing breakfast before work, their conversations a low murmur that created an atmosphere of comfortable sophistication. Gabriel spoke quietly to the hostess, an elegant woman in her 30s who seemed to know him well. She smiled warmly and led us to a corner table that offered both privacy and a view of the bustling street outside. I noticed that several other diners glanced our way as we passed, their expressions a mixture of recognition and curiosity. "You come here often," I observed as Gabriel held my chair for me. "Often enough," he agreed, settling across from me. "The owner is a friend of mine." "Friend from business?" Something flickered in his dark eyes, amusement mixed with something that might have been approval. "You don't pull your punches, do you?" "Should I?" "No," he said, his smile genuine. "I like that about you." And to answer your question, Marco Luna is an old friend from the neighborhood. We grew up together. His restaurant is completely legitimate, I assure you. The way he said, completely legitimate, suggested that not all of his business relationships could make the same claim, but I decided not to press the issue. I was still trying to process the fact that I was sitting in an upscale cafe with Gabriel Russo, about to eat breakfast that probably cost more than I usually spent on food in a week. A waiter appeared with coffee and fresh orange juice, both of which tasted better than anything I'd had in recent memory. The coffee was rich and smooth, without the bitter edge that came from sitting on a hot plate for too long, and the orange juice was clearly freshly squeezed. "This is wonderful," I said, taking another sip of the coffee. "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" Gabriel asked, studying me with those perceptive dark eyes. I bristled slightly at the implication. "I eat." "I'm sure you do. But when was the last time you ate somewhere like this? Somewhere you could actually enjoy the food instead of just consuming calories?" I thought about it, trying to remember the last time I'd eaten at a restaurant where I wasn't working. It had been months, maybe longer. Most of my meals came from the diner during my shifts, or consisted of whatever was cheapest at the grocery store. "It's been a while," I admitted. "I thought so." His expression softened. "Order whatever you want, Grace, and I mean that." When the waiter returned to take our order, I chose the eggs Benedict Gabriel had mentioned, along with fresh fruit and hash browns that were described as being made with locally sourced potatoes. Gabriel ordered the same, plus additional pastries that he insisted we share. "So," he said once the waiter had left, "tell me about yourself. What do you want to know?" "Everything. Where you're from, how you ended up in the city, what you want to do with your life." It was such a normal question, the kind of thing people asked on regular dates. But coming from Gabriel Russo, it felt loaded with significance. I found myself talking more than I had in months, telling him about growing up in a small town 3 hours north of the city, about my mother's death from cancer when I was 17, about my decision to come to the city in search of opportunities that had proven more elusive than I'd hoped. He listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and making observations that showed he was really paying attention. It had been so long since someone had shown genuine interest in my thoughts and experiences that I found myself opening up more than I'd intended. "What about college?" he asked when I mentioned my job at the coffee shop downtown. "I was planning to go," I said, stirring my coffee to avoid meeting his eyes. "I had scholarships lined up, everything arranged, but when my mom got sick, I used the money for her medical bills instead." "And after she died?" "The scholarships were gone by then, and I needed to work to survive." I shrugged, trying to project a casualness I didn't feel. "College will still be there when I can afford it." "What would you study?" "Business, maybe, or education. I always thought I might like to teach." When our food arrived, it was even better than I'd expected. The eggs Benedict were perfectly prepared, with a hollandaise sauce that was rich without being heavy, and the English muffins were clearly made in-house. I tried to eat slowly, to savor each bite, but I was hungrier than I'd realized, and the food was too good to pace myself properly. Gabriel watched me eat with obvious satisfaction, occasionally pushing the pastry plate in my direction and insisting I try different items. There was something almost intimate about sharing food with him, about the way he seemed to take pleasure in my enjoyment of the meal. "You're very generous," I said when he flagged down the waiter to order more coffee and fresh fruit. "With people who deserve it," he replied. "Tell me, Grace, what are your goals? Where do you see yourself in 5 years?" It was a question I'd been avoiding asking myself, afraid of the answer. My goals had become so focused on basic survival that I'd stopped thinking about the future in terms of hopes and dreams. I don't know, I said honestly. Right now, I'm just trying to get by day to day. That's not living, Gabriel said quietly. That's existing. Sometimes existing is the best you can do. It doesn't have to be. There was something in his voice that made me look up from my plate, meeting his intense gaze. What do you mean? I mean that you deserve better than working the night shift at a diner, worrying about whether you can afford groceries. You're intelligent, hardworking, beautiful. You should have opportunities, choices. Mr. Russo. Gabriel, he corrected gently. Gabriel, I repeated, his name feeling strange on my tongue. I appreciate what you're saying, but I'm not looking for charity. I'm not offering charity, he said. I'm suggesting that perhaps there are other options available to you, better options. I set down my fork, a chill running down my spine despite the warmth of the cafe. What kind of options? The kind that come with knowing the right people. The words hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't sure I wanted to explore. This was what Frank had been warning me about, what I'd sensed from the moment Gabriel walked into the diner. He wasn't just being kind to a struggling waitress out of the goodness of his heart. He wanted something. And what would you want in return? I asked, proud of how steady my voice sounded. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, studying me with those dark, intelligent eyes. What makes you think I'd want anything in return? Because men like you don't do anything without expecting something back. Men like me, he repeated, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. And what kind of man do you think I am, Grace? The kind who has people investigated before taking them to breakfast. His smile widened. Touché. You're right, of course. I don't do anything without considering the potential benefits. But in this case, the benefit I'm hoping for is very simple. Which is your company. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline or the clarification that would reveal what he really meant. When neither came, I shook my head. I don't understand. It's not complicated, Gabriel said, his voice gentler than I'd heard it before. I'm attracted to you, Grace. I find you interesting, compelling. I'd like to spend more time with you. Why? The question seemed to surprise him. Why what? Why me? You could have any woman you wanted. Rich women, sophisticated women, women who know how to dress and act in your world. Why would you be interested in a waitress from Murphy's Diner? Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice was serious, without a trace of the charm he'd been displaying all morning. Because those other women want something from me, he said. Money, status, connections. They see Gabriel Russo, the businessman, the power broker. You called me at 3 a.m. to return my wallet because it was the right thing to do. You didn't ask for a reward, and when I offered one, you turned it down. You're having breakfast with me not because of what I can do for you, but because you're curious about who I am as a person. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. Do you have any idea how rare that is in my world? I felt something shift in my chest, a dangerous softening toward this man who seemed genuinely moved by what I considered basic human decency. But I forced myself to remember Frank. That still doesn't explain what you want from me, I said, trying to maintain some distance despite the way his words affected me. Gabriel reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine where they rested beside my coffee cup. The contact sent an electric shock up my arm, and I had to resist the urge to pull away. I want to get to know you, he said simply. I want to take you to dinner, to show you parts of the city you've never seen. I want to hear your thoughts, your dreams, your fears. I want to make you smile the way you did when you tasted that hollandaise sauce. And in return, In return, you let me take care of you." His thumb traced across my knuckles, the touch so gentle it was almost reverent. "You let me make sure you never have to worry about money again, never have to work a job that leaves you exhausted and frustrated. You let me give you the life you deserve." There it was. The offer I'd been expecting, wrapped in pretty words and delivered with what seemed like genuine emotion. I pulled my hand away from his, needing to think clearly without the distraction of his touch. "What you're describing sounds like you want to buy me," I said quietly. Gabriel's expression darkened. "Is that what you think this is? Isn't it?" "No." His voice was firm, almost angry. "What I'm offering is a partnership, a relationship. I'm not looking for a woman I can purchase, Grace. I'm looking for someone who can stand beside me, who can be part of my life in a meaningful way. Someone who won't ask too many questions about your business. Someone who understands that there are aspects of my life that must remain separate," he corrected, "for their own protection as much as mine." I stared at him, trying to read the truth in his dark eyes. Everything about this situation screamed danger, from his reputation to the obvious wealth that couldn't all be coming from legitimate sources. But there was something else there too, something that looked almost like vulnerability beneath his confident exterior. "I need to think about this," I said finally. Gabriel nodded, seeming to have expected that response. "Of course. But while you're thinking, consider this. What do you have to lose?" "My independence, my self-respect, possibly my life, if your enemies decide I'm a liability." "Your independence would be protected," he said seriously. "I'm not looking for a kept woman, Grace. I'm looking for a partner. As for your safety, you'd be under my protection. No one would dare harm you. And if I decide I don't want this life anymore, if I want to leave—" Something flickered in his eyes, gone too quickly for me to identify. "Then you'd leave." I didn't believe him, not entirely. Men like Gabriel Russo didn't let go of things they considered theirs. But the alternative was returning to my one-bedroom apartment, to the night shift at Murphy's, to a life of constant financial worry and social isolation. The waiter appeared with the check, which Gabriel settled with cash and a generous tip. As we prepared to leave, I caught sight of myself in the mirror behind our table. I looked exactly like what I was. A tired young woman in a cheap uniform, completely out of place among the polished professionals who filled the cafe. "Grace," Gabriel said as Vincent held the car door open for us, "before you make your decision, let me show you something." Instead of returning to the diner or my apartment, Vincent drove us through the most exclusive part of the city, where the houses sat on large lots behind iron gates and perfectly manicured lawns. We pulled up in front of a building that took my breath away, a converted warehouse with floor-to-ceiling windows and a rooftop garden that looked like something from a magazine. "What is this place?" I asked, as Gabriel led me to a private elevator. "Something I think you might like to see." The elevator opened directly into a loft apartment that was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The space was enormous, with exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and modern furniture that managed to look both expensive and comfortable. But what really caught my attention was the wall of books that stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with volumes that ranged from classic literature to contemporary fiction to academic texts on subjects I'd only dreamed of studying. "You like to read," Gabriel observed, watching my reaction. "I love to read," I breathed, moving toward the books like a moth drawn to flame. "I haven't been able to afford new books in years. The library is my best friend." "This could be yours," he said quietly. I turned to stare at him. "What?" "This apartment. It's empty right now, but it could be yours. Fully furnished, all utilities paid, with enough money each month to live comfortably while you figure out what you want to do with your life." "In exchange for what?" "Your company. Your time. Your willingness to be part of my world." I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. From here, I could see Murphy's diner in the distance, a tiny speck among the urban sprawl. The contrast between this luxury and my current life was so stark, it almost felt like looking at two different planets. "I'm pregnant," I said suddenly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. The silence behind me stretched for so long that I finally turned around. Gabriel's expression was unreadable, his dark eyes studying me with an intensity that made my heart race. "How far along?" he asked finally. "About 8 weeks. "And the father?" "Gone. He was just a mistake. A one-night thing when I was feeling particularly lonely." Gabriel moved closer, his steps measured and deliberate. "Does that change what I'm offering?" "No." "Does it change what I want from you?" "No. If anything, it makes me more determined to ensure you're taken care of." "Why?" The question came out as barely a whisper. "Because you shouldn't have to face this alone." He reached out, his hand cupping my cheek with surprising gentleness. "Because I meant what I said about wanting to take care of you. All of you." I leaned into his touch despite myself, craving the human contact I'd been denying myself for so long. When was the last time someone had touched me with such tenderness? When was the last time someone had looked at me the way Gabriel was looking at me now, as if I were something precious and worth protecting? "This is crazy," I whispered. "Sometimes the best things are," he replied, his thumb tracing across my cheekbone. Before I could analyze what I was doing, I found myself nodding. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but Gabriel saw it. His smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face with genuine joy. "You'll do it? You'll let me take care of you?" "I'll try," I said, the words feeling like a leap off a cliff. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "I want to keep working, at least for now. I need some independence, some connection to my old life while I figure out this new one." Gabriel frowned slightly. "I'd prefer if you didn't have to work." "That's not negotiable." After a moment, he nodded. "All right. What else?" "I want honesty between us. I won't ask about your business, but I won't tolerate being lied to about things that affect me directly." "Agreed." "And if I decide this isn't working, if I want out, you'll let me go." The pause was longer this time, and when Gabriel spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "If that's what you truly want, then yes, I'll let you go." I studied his face, looking for signs of deception, but his expression revealed nothing. Either he was an exceptional liar, or he genuinely meant what he said. Given his reputation, both were equally possible. "Okay," I said finally. "Let's see what happens." Gabriel's response was to kiss me, his lips capturing mine with a hunger that spoke of desires held carefully in check. I melted into him, my hands fisting in the expensive fabric of his suit jacket as I kissed him back with an enthusiasm that should have alarmed me. When we finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Gabriel rested his forehead against mine. "You won't regret this, Grace. I promise you that." As he held me in that beautiful apartment, surrounded by luxury I'd never imagined possessing, I wanted desperately to believe him. But a small voice in the back of my mind, sounding remarkably like Frank's warning from the diner, whispered that promises from men like Gabriel Russo were as dangerous as they were seductive. Only time would tell which voice was right. 3 weeks into my new life, I was beginning to understand why fairy tales ended with happily ever after, rather than exploring what came next. The apartment Gabriel had shown me was indeed mine, along with a wardrobe that had appeared as if by magic, filled with clothes in my exact size that cost more than I'd made in months at Murphy's. A weekly allowance was deposited into a new bank account, enough money to live comfortably without ever having to worry about bills or groceries. But fairy tales, I was learning, didn't prepare you for the complex realities of being cared for by a man whose business dealings remained shrouded in deliberate mystery. I still worked at Murphy's, though I'd reduced my schedule to 3 nights a week at Gabriel's insistence. He'd wanted me to quit entirely, but I'd held firm on that point, needing some connection to my old life. Some reminder of who I'd been before Gabriel Russo swept into my world with his expensive suits and dangerous smile. Marge had been suspicious of my sudden improved circumstances, making pointed comments about sugar daddies and girls who get too big for their britches. But the tips from my remaining shifts, combined with Gabriel's generosity, meant I could finally afford things I'd only dreamed of. Health insurance, prenatal vitamins, regular doctor's appointments for the baby that was growing steadily inside me. It was Tuesday morning, and I was sitting in Dr. Martinez's office, staring at the ultrasound image that showed a tiny, perfect form with a heartbeat that filled the room with its rapid rhythm. 12 weeks along now, and everything looked healthy and normal. "Would you like to know the sex?" Dr. Martinez asked, her kind eyes crinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses. "It's too early, isn't it?" "Usually, yes, but this little one is positioned perfectly, and I can see enough to make an educated guess." She pointed to the screen. "I'm fairly confident you're having a daughter." A daughter. I stared at the grainy image, trying to process the reality of it. In 6 months, I would be responsible for another human being, a little girl who would depend on me for everything. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. "Is there a father who'll be involved?" Dr. Martinez asked gently, not for the first time. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. Gabriel wasn't the father, but he'd been present for everything since I'd accepted his offer. He'd accompanied me to my last appointment, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes on a leather portfolio that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. When I'd expressed concern about affording the recommended tests and vitamins, he'd quietly handled all the expenses without making me feel like a charity case. "Yes," I said finally. "There's someone who's very involved." Dr. Martinez smiled. "Good. Having support makes all the difference." After the appointment, I walked slowly back to my apartment, my mind churning with thoughts of the future. The morning was crisp and clear, with that quality of light that made even the city's rough edges look softer, more forgiving. I'd grown to love this neighborhood, with its tree-lined streets and small shops that felt more like a community than the anonymous sprawl where I'd lived before. My phone buzzed with a text from Gabriel. "How did the appointment go?" "Perfect. Everything looks healthy," I replied, then added, "It's a girl." My phone rang almost immediately. "A daughter." Gabriel's voice was warm with something that sounded like genuine pleasure. "How do you feel about that?" "Scared," I admitted. "Happy, but scared." "That's normal. Are you at home?" "Just walking back from the doctor's office." "I'll come by tonight. We should celebrate." "Gabriel, you don't need to." "I want to," he interrupted gently. "Let me take care of this, Grace. Let me take care of you." Those words had become his refrain over the past 3 weeks, and each time he said them, they sent a confusing mixture of warmth and unease through my chest. Being taken care of was wonderful in many ways, but it also meant being dependent, being owned in a way that sometimes made me feel claustrophobic, despite the luxury surrounding me. I was unlocking my apartment door when I noticed the man standing across the street. He was trying to look casual, reading a newspaper while leaning against a lamppost, but something about his posture screamed surveillance. This was the 3rd time I'd seen him in the past week, always in different locations, but always watching. Inside my apartment, I went to the window and peered through the curtains. The man was still there, his attention focused on my building. I pulled out my phone and called Gabriel. "There's someone watching my apartment," I said, without preamble when he answered. "Describe him." I gave Gabriel the details I could make out from my window. Average height, dark hair, wearing jeans and a leather jacket. Gabriel was quiet for a moment, His name is Marcus, he said finally. He works for me. You're having me watched? Protected, Gabriel corrected smoothly. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like surveillance. Grace, we've discussed this. My world comes with certain risks. I won't have you exposed to danger simply because you're important to me. Important to him. The phrase should have made me happy, but instead, it highlighted the fundamental problem with our arrangement. I was important to Gabriel, which meant I was potentially valuable to his enemies. The protection he provided was as much about safeguarding his interests as it was about keeping me safe. You should have told me, I said. Would it have changed anything? It would have prepared me. I don't like finding out about things like this by accident. You're right, Gabriel said, and the ready acknowledgement surprised me. I should have been more transparent. I'll do better. After we hung up, I sat on my expensive sofa in my beautiful apartment and tried to process what I'd learned. The man outside was protection, Gabriel had said. But protection from what? What kind of danger was I in simply by being associated with him? That evening, Gabriel arrived with dinner from an upscale Italian restaurant, the kind of place where reservations were required weeks in advance. He'd changed from his usual business attire into dark jeans and a cashmere sweater that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and made his dark eyes look almost black. You look tired, he said, studying my face as he set the food containers on my dining table. I am tired. Pregnancy fatigue is no joke. Then you should quit Murphy's. There's no reason for you to exhaust yourself with a job you don't need. We'd had this conversation before, and it always ended the same way. Gabriel couldn't understand why I insisted on maintaining any connection to my old life, and I couldn't make him understand that working gave me something his money couldn't, a sense of purpose and independence. We're not having this argument again, I said, moving to help him set out the food. It's not an argument, Gabriel replied, catching my hand and pulling me gently against him. It's concern. You're carrying my daughter. She's not your daughter, I said automatically, then immediately regretted the words when I saw his expression shudder. Gabriel released me, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Of course. I misspoke. Gabriel, I didn't mean... Yes, you did. His voice was calm, but I could hear the hurt beneath the surface. And you're right. Biologically, she's not mine. But I'm the one who's here, Grace. I'm the one who's invested in her future. In your future. I'm the one who wants to be her father in every way that matters. The raw honesty in his words made my chest tight. Over the past 3 weeks, Gabriel had shown more interest in my pregnancy than the baby's actual father ever had. He'd read books on child development, asked thoughtful questions about my health, and even started talking about setting up a nursery in a way that suggested he saw this child as his own. I know, I said softly. And I'm grateful. But this is all so overwhelming sometimes. 3 weeks ago, I was a waitress living paycheck to paycheck. Now I'm living in luxury, being protected by armed guards, and having a baby with a man who... Who what? Who I still don't really know. Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying my face. What would you like to know? Everything. Where you came from, how you built your business, what your life was like before you met me. Some stories aren't pleasant, Grace. I'm not looking for pleasant. I'm looking for honest. Gabriel moved to the window, staring out at the city lights that stretched toward the horizon. When he spoke, his voice was distant, as if he were recounting someone else's story. My father came here from Sicily when he was 18, he began. He had nothing but the clothes on his back and a willingness to do whatever it took to survive. He started by running numbers for the established families, then gradually built his own operation. By the time I was born, he owned half the restaurants in Little Italy and had interests in construction, waste management, and several other industries. Legal industries? Gabriel's smile was without humor. Some more legal than others. My father believed in diversification, in having multiple streams of income. He also believed in tradition, in family loyalty, in protecting what was his by any means necessary. And you inherited all of that. I inherited the responsibility, yes. But I also inherited the enemies, the expectations, the constant need to prove that I was worthy of my father's legacy. I joined him at the window, close enough to touch but maintaining some distance. Do you ever regret it? The life you inherited? Every day, he said quietly. But regret doesn't change reality. I am who I am, Grace. I've done things I'm not proud of, made choices that keep me awake at night. But I've also built something that provides for hundreds of families, that brings order to chaos, that protects people who can't protect themselves, including me, especially you. He turned to face me, his expression intense. You asked for honesty, so here it is. The moment you called to return my wallet, you became part of my world, whether you realized it or not. My enemies know about you now. They know you're important to me, which makes you a target. The protection isn't optional, Grace. It's necessary. The weight of his words settled over me like a shroud. I'd been naive to think I could maintain some separation between my old life and my new one. Naive to believe that accepting Gabriel's care didn't come with serious consequences. What kind of enemies? I asked. The kind who see any perceived weakness as an opportunity. Gabriel's jaw tightened. There's a man named Vincent Castellano who's been making moves against my organization. He's ambitious, ruthless, and he believes that my feelings for you make me vulnerable. Do they? Gabriel's laugh was harsh. Completely. Caring about someone gives your enemies leverage, and Vincent is smart enough to recognize that. So what does that mean for us? For the baby? It means that until Vincent is no longer a threat, you'll have protection wherever you go. It means that certain precautions will need to be taken, certain freedoms temporarily restricted. I felt the walls of my golden cage closing in around me. For how long? I don't know. The honest answer was somehow worse than false reassurance would have been. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly feeling cold despite the warmth of the apartment. Grace, Gabriel said, moving closer. I know this isn't what you signed up for when you agreed to let me take care of you. If you want out... Do I really have that option? I interrupted. You just told me I'm a target because of my connection to you. How exactly do I walk away from that? Gabriel's silence was answer enough. We both knew that there was no going back to my old life. No pretending that I was just a waitress at Murphy's Diner. I was Gabriel Russo's woman now, with all the privileges and dangers that entailed. I'm sorry, he said finally. I never wanted to put you in this position. But you did. Yes, I did. Because I'm selfish enough to want you in my life even knowing the risks. His brutal honesty was more affecting than any pretty lie would have been. At least he wasn't trying to pretend that my safety hadn't been compromised by our relationship. Wasn't attempting to minimize the reality of what I'd gotten myself into. The baby, I said, my hand moving unconsciously to my stomach. Will she be safe? I'd die before I let anything happen to either of you, Gabriel said, the fierce certainty in his voice leaving no room for doubt. You have my word on that. I wanted to believe him. Needed to believe him. Because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. But as we ate dinner and talked about safer topics like baby names and nursery decorations, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed a line from which there was no return. Outside my window, Marcus maintained his vigil, a reminder that my life now required armed protection. Inside, Gabriel spoke tenderly about our future together. painting pictures of a life filled with love and security. But beneath his words lurked the unspoken truth. I was no longer just Grace Chen, struggling waitress with dreams of a better life. I was Gabriel Russo's weakness made flesh, and in his world, weakness was the most dangerous thing of all. 2 months had passed since Gabriel's revelation about Vincent Castellano, and the reality of living under constant protection was beginning to wear on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Marcus had been joined by a second guard named Tony, and between the two of them, my movements were monitored 24 hours a day. They were professional and respectful, but their presence was a constant reminder that my life was no longer entirely my own. The pregnancy was progressing beautifully, according to Dr. Martinez. At 16 weeks, my daughter was developing perfectly, and the morning sickness had finally subsided enough for me to enjoy food again. Gabriel had been present for every appointment, asking detailed questions and taking notes with the dedication of someone preparing for the most important job of his life. It was Thursday evening, and I was working my shift at Murphy's despite Gabriel's continued protests. He'd wanted me to quit entirely once the security situation had escalated, but working 3 nights a week was one of the few pieces of my old life I'd managed to preserve. The familiar routine of taking orders and serving coffee provided a sense of normalcy that I desperately needed. "You're glowing," Marge commented as I refilled the coffee station. "Must be that prenatal glow everyone talks about." I'd told her about the pregnancy the week before, unable to hide the expanding curve of my belly any longer. To my surprise, she'd been supportive rather than judgmental, even helping me adjust my uniform to accommodate my changing shape. "Either that or the expensive face cream Gabriel bought me," I replied, earning a snort of laughter from Marge. "Still can't believe you landed yourself a sugar daddy," she said, shaking her head. "Though I have to admit, he seems to actually care about you. That's rare in arrangements like this." Arrangements like this. The phrase stung because it reduced what Gabriel and I shared to a simple transaction. But wasn't that exactly what it was? I provided companionship and the promise of a family, and he provided financial security and protection. The fact that genuine feelings had developed between us didn't change the fundamental nature of our relationship. Frank was in his usual corner booth when I brought him his nightly coffee and pie. Over the past 2 months, he'd become something of a father figure to me, offering advice and concern without judgment. He was one of the few people who knew the full truth about my situation with Gabriel. "How are you feeling, Grace?" he asked, his weathered face creasing with concern as he studied my appearance. "Like I'm living in a movie," I admitted, glancing around to make sure Marge wasn't within earshot. "Sometimes I can't believe this is my life now." "Any regrets?" It was a question Frank asked regularly, and my answer was always complicated. Did I regret accepting Gabriel's offer? Not exactly. Did I regret the loss of my independence, the constant security presence, the knowledge that I was now a target for Gabriel's enemies? Absolutely. "Some days," I said honestly. "But then I think about the baby, about being able to provide for her in ways I never could have before." "And about Gabriel himself?" I felt heat rise to my cheeks. Over the past 2 months, my feelings for Gabriel had deepened in ways that both thrilled and terrified me. He was attentive and generous, showing up at my apartment with flowers, books, and thoughtful gifts that showed how carefully he listened to my casual comments. He'd held my hair when morning sickness struck, rubbed my feet when they ached from work, and talked to my growing belly with a tenderness that made my heart race. But he was also someone who spoke casually about eliminating threats, who conducted business meetings that ended with ominous phone calls made in rapid Italian. The contrast between the gentle man who read pregnancy books and the dangerous power broker who commanded fear and respect was something I was still learning to navigate. "He's complicated," I said finally. Frank nodded knowingly. "The dangerous ones usually are. Just promise me you'll be careful, Grace. Men like Gabriel Russo don't love the way normal people do. They possess, they control, they protect. Sometimes those things look like love, but they're not the same thing. Before I could respond, the bell above the front door chimed, and I looked up to see Gabriel entering the diner. He moved with his usual controlled grace, but there was something different about his demeanor tonight. A tension in his shoulders that set my nerves on edge. "Gabriel," I said as he approached the counter, "I wasn't expecting you tonight." "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." I glanced around the diner. It was a slow night, with only Frank and one other customer present. Marge was in the back office doing paperwork. "I can't leave my shift." "Yes, you can." Gabriel's tone brooked no argument. "This is important, Grace." Something in his expression alarmed me. I'd never seen him look quite so serious, so focused. I quickly untied my apron and followed him outside, where Vincent was waiting beside the familiar black sedan. "What's wrong?" I asked as soon as we were in the car. "Vincent made his move," Gabriel said grimly. 3 hours ago, his men hit one of my warehouses. 2 of my people are dead, and he took something that belongs to me. I felt the blood drain from my face. "What kind of something?" "Financial records, client lists, shipping manifests, information that could destroy everything I've built if it falls into the wrong hands." "The police can't help with this," Gabriel interrupted. "Vincent is connected, Grace. He has judges, prosecutors, even some federal agents in his pocket. This has to be handled through other channels." Other channels. I didn't need him to spell out what that meant. Whatever Gabriel was planning to do to retrieve his stolen property, it wouldn't be legal. "What does this mean for us?" I asked, my hand moving instinctively to my belly. Gabriel's expression softened slightly. "It means that the timeline has accelerated. Vincent is forcing my hand, making me choose between protecting what I've built and protecting you." "And what are you choosing?" "Both." His voice was steel wrapped in velvet, but it's going to require sacrifices from both of us. The car pulled up in front of a building I'd never seen before, a nondescript office complex in the financial district. Gabriel led me to a private elevator that required a keycard to operate, and we rode up to the top floor in tense silence. The penthouse office was all glass and chrome, with a spectacular view of the city skyline. But what caught my attention was the man standing behind the massive desk, someone I'd never seen before, but who radiated the same dangerous authority as Gabriel. "Grace?" Gabriel said, his hand warm on the small of my back. "I'd like you to meet my attorney, David Rossi." David was a man in his 50s with silver hair and expensive clothing that didn't quite disguise the hardness in his eyes. He studied me with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to assessing value and risk. "Ms. Chen," he said, extending his hand. "Gabriel has told me a great deal about you." I shook his hand warily. "Mr. Rossi." "Please sit," Gabriel said, guiding me to a leather chair across from David's desk. "What I'm about to discuss with you affects our future, Grace. I need you to listen carefully." I sat down, my heart racing with anticipation and dread. Whatever Gabriel was about to propose, I had the feeling it would change everything between us. "Vincent has left me with limited options," Gabriel began, pacing behind my chair. "He's stolen information that could send me to prison for the rest of my life if it reaches the federal prosecutors. But more than that, he's made it clear that he considers you and the baby to be acceptable casualties in his war against me." "What do you mean?" David pulled a folder from his desk and removed several photographs, placing them face down in front of me. "These were taken yesterday," he said quietly. "Vincent's men conducting surveillance on your apartment building, your route to work, the medical center where you have your prenatal appointments." I stared at the photographs, afraid to turn them over. "They're watching me." "They're hunting you," Gabriel corrected grimly. "Vincent believes that eliminating you would be the fastest way to destabilize my organization." A grieving man makes poor decisions, he thinks. The casual way they discussed my potential murder made my stomach lurch. I pressed my hand to my mouth, fighting down nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy hormones. "What are you asking of me?" I whispered. Gabriel knelt beside my chair, taking my hands in his. "I'm asking you to marry me." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What?" "Not because I don't want to," Gabriel said quickly, his dark eyes intense. "I've wanted to ask you properly, with a ring and romance and all the things you deserve. But circumstances have forced my hand." I stared at him, struggling to process what he was saying. "You want to marry me to protect me from Vincent?" "I want to marry you because I love you," Gabriel said, his voice raw with emotion. "But yes, marriage would provide certain legal protections. As my wife, you'd be entitled to enhanced security, untouchable status within my organization, and—" He hesitated. "And what?" David answered for him. "As Gabriel's widow, you'd inherit everything. His legitimate businesses, his assets, his power. Vincent knows this. Killing you after you're married would be significantly more complicated for him." The implication was clear. Gabriel expected this war with Vincent to end with one of them dead, and he wanted to ensure that if he didn't survive, I'd be protected by the full weight of his legacy. "You're planning to get yourself killed," I said, pulling my hands away from his. "I'm planning to end this threat permanently," Gabriel corrected, "but I'd be a fool not to prepare for all possible outcomes." I stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that offered a panoramic view of the city lights. Down there, people were living normal lives, worrying about ordinary problems like job security and mortgage payments. Here, I was being asked to marry a man I loved but barely knew, in preparation for a war that might leave our child fatherless. "What if I say no?" I asked without turning around. "Then I'll respect your decision," Gabriel said, "but I'll also have to take more extreme measures to ensure your safety. Complete isolation, relocation, perhaps even witness protection if David can arrange it. And our relationship would effectively be over." The brutal honesty in his voice made my chest tight. He wasn't trying to manipulate me with false promises or emotional blackmail. He was laying out the stark realities of our situation and asking me to choose. "How long do I have to decide?" "The ceremony would need to happen within the week," David said. "Vincent is moving quickly and we need to stay ahead of him." A week. 7 days to decide whether to marry a man who loved me but could offer no guarantee of a future together. 7 days to choose between the security of his name and the freedom of my current limbo. I turned back to face Gabriel, studying his face for any sign of deception or manipulation. Instead, I saw something that looked almost like fear. Not of Vincent or the coming conflict, but of my potential rejection. "If I marry you," I said slowly, "what does that make me? Your wife or your final business transaction?" Gabriel's expression grew pained. "You'd be my wife, Grace. The woman I love. The mother of my daughter. The most important person in my world. The fact that our marriage would also serve strategic purposes doesn't diminish what you mean to me. And if you don't survive this war with Vincent, then you'll be wealthy, protected, and free to raise our daughter away from all of this." Gabriel's voice was steady, but I could see the cost of those words in his eyes. "You'd be able to give her the life you wanted for yourself. Education, opportunities, choices. Our daughter." He kept saying it that way, as if the child I carried were already his in every way that mattered. And maybe she was. The biological father was long gone, while Gabriel had been present for every milestone, every appointment, every moment of fear and joy. "I need time to think," I said finally. Gabriel nodded, though I could see the disappointment he was trying to hide. "Of course. But Grace..." He moved closer, his hand cupping my cheek with devastating tenderness. "Whatever you decide, know that these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You've given me something I never thought I'd have. A family to protect. A future to fight for." As David drove me back to my apartment, my mind churned with impossible choices. Marry Gabriel and become permanently part of his dangerous world, or refuse and lose him forever while potentially putting our child at risk. Outside my building, Marcus and Tony maintained their vigilant watch, reminders that the fantasy of returning to my old life was exactly that, a fantasy. I was already part of Gabriel's world, whether I wore his ring or not. The only question was whether I'd face the coming storm as his wife, or as a woman he'd once cared for but had to let go. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my hand resting on my growing belly. At 17 weeks, I could feel the baby's movements more clearly now, little flutters that reminded me that whatever decision I made would affect not just my life, but hers as well. My phone buzzed with a text from Gabriel. "Sweet dreams, Grace. I love you." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "I love you too." It was the first time I'd said it, and somehow typing those words into my phone at 2 a.m. felt like crossing a line. If I loved him, and I did, despite all the complications and dangers, then didn't I owe it to both of us to try to build something real together? But love and marriage were different things, especially when the marriage came with the expectation that I might become a widow before my child was born. Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was making breakfast when my building's doorman called to announce that a woman named Elena Rossi was asking to see me. David's wife, presumably, though I couldn't imagine what she wanted. Elena turned out to be an elegant woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an understated style that spoke of quiet wealth. She accepted my offer of coffee and settled into my living room with the easy grace of someone accustomed to navigating delicate social situations. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested European origins. "Gabriel asked David not to pressure you about the marriage proposal, but he didn't say anything about wives offering perspective." I curled up in the chair across from her, cradling my coffee cup. "What kind of perspective?" "The kind that comes from being married to a man in Gabriel's line of work for 23 years. I studied her face, looking for signs of the wear and tear that such a life might leave. Instead, I saw a woman who appeared confident and content, with laugh lines around her eyes and a wedding ring that caught the light with every gesture. "Is it worth it?" I asked bluntly. "The constant worry, the security, the knowledge that your husband might not come home one night?" Elena was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "That depends on what you value most," she said finally. "If you need certainty, predictability, a husband who comes home every night at 6 o'clock, then no, men like Gabriel and David can't offer that." "What can they offer?" "Devotion that borders on obsession," Elena said with a slight smile. "Protection that extends to every aspect of your life. Loyalty that never wavers, even when everything else falls apart. And love that burns so intensely it can sustain you through the darkest times." She leaned forward, her expression growing serious. "But you have to understand, Grace, that their love comes with expectations. They don't just want to be loved in return. They want to be trusted completely, even when they can't explain their actions. They want to be the center of your world the way you become the center of theirs." That sounds suffocating. It can be, if you fight it. But if you embrace it, if you let yourself be cherished and protected the way they need to cherish and protect, it can be the most secure feeling in the world. I thought about Gabriel's tenderness with me over the past months, the way he seemed to anticipate my needs before I was even aware of them. There had been moments when his attention felt overwhelming, but there had also been moments when I'd felt more valued and cared for than ever before in my life. What about the danger? I asked. Aren't you afraid? Terrified, Elena admitted. Every time David leaves for a meeting I don't know about, every time his phone rings in the middle of the night, every time I see tension in his shoulders that he won't explain. But Grace, every marriage has risks. At least with men like ours, we know what we're facing. And if something happens to them? Elena's expression grew sad. Then we mourn them, raise our children to remember them with pride, and find ways to honor their legacy. But we don't waste the time we have with them living in fear of what might happen. After Elena left, I spent the day walking through the city, always accompanied by Marcus and Tony at a discreet distance. I found myself in the neighborhood where I used to live, standing outside my old apartment building with its peeling paint and broken security door. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who owned the flower shop below my former apartment, spotted me through her window and came out to greet me. She looked me up and down, taking in my obviously expensive clothes and the subtle changes that pregnancy and Gabriel's care had brought to my appearance. "Well, look at you," she said with a knowing smile. "I heard you'd moved up in the world." "Something like that," I replied, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "That man who came looking for you a few months back," she continued. "Handsome fellow in an expensive car. I take it things worked out with him?" I nodded, surprised that Gabriel had been here looking for me. He'd never mentioned visiting my old neighborhood. "He seemed very concerned about you," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Asked a lot of questions about whether you'd been eating properly, whether you seemed happy. Not the kinds of questions a man asks unless he truly cares." As I walked back to my new life, Mrs. Patterson's words echoed in my mind. Gabriel had been checking on me even before I'd accepted his offer, making sure I was safe and cared for without any guarantee that I'd ever be part of his life. That evening, Gabriel arrived at my apartment with dinner from my favorite Thai restaurant and a bouquet of the white roses I'd once mentioned loving. He was dressed casually in dark jeans and a sweater, but I could see the tension in his shoulders that Elena had warned me about. "How was your day?" I asked as we settled down to eat. "Productive," he said, which I'd learned was Gabriel's way of saying he'd been dealing with business I was better off not knowing about. "And yours?" "Educational. I had a visitor this morning." Gabriel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Oh?" "Elena Rossi. She wanted to give me perspective on marriage to a man in your line of work." Gabriel set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, studying my face. "And what perspective did she offer?" "That it's worth it if you're willing to accept the terms." "And are you? Willing to accept the terms?" I looked at this man who'd turned my life upside down in the most wonderful and terrifying ways, who loved me enough to marry me even knowing it might make him a target, who spoke about my unborn daughter as if she were already his own. "Ask me properly," I said quietly. Gabriel's eyes widened slightly, hope and surprise flickering across his features. "Grace, if you want to marry me," I interrupted, "ask me the way you wanted to ask before circumstances forced your hand. With a ring and romance and all the things you think I deserve." Gabriel stood slowly, his dark eyes never leaving mine. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, setting it on the table between us. "I bought this 2 weeks after you moved into this apartment," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been carrying it with me ever since, waiting for the right moment." He opened the box to reveal a ring that took my breath away. Not because of its obvious value, though the central diamond was stunning, but because of its thoughtful design. The setting was vintage-inspired, with delicate details that reminded me of my grandmother's jewelry, and the band was inscribed with words in Italian. "What does the inscription say?" I asked. "Sei la mia vita," Gabriel replied. "You are my life." He took the ring from the box and knelt beside my chair, taking my left hand in his. "Grace Chen, You are the most extraordinary woman I've ever known. You're brave and kind and honest in a world that values none of those things. You've given me hope for a future I never dared to imagine, and you're carrying the most precious gift I could ever receive." Tears blurred my vision as he continued, his voice steady despite the emotion I could see in his dark eyes. "I know I can't promise you a simple life or a safe one. I know that loving me means accepting risks that no woman should have to face. But I can promise you that you'll never doubt how much you mean to me. I can promise that I'll spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of your love. And I can promise that our daughter will grow up knowing she's cherished by a father who chose her, even if he didn't create her." He paused, his thumb tracing across my knuckles. "Will you marry me, Grace? Will you be my wife, my partner, my family?" "Yes," I whispered, the word escaping before I could fully process my decision. "Yes, I'll marry you." Gabriel's smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for me, which, knowing Gabriel's attention to detail, it probably had been. He stood and pulled me into his arms, kissing me with a passion that spoke of relief and joy and promises for the future. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. "You won't regret this," he murmured. "I swear to you, Grace, you won't regret this." As he held me in my beautiful apartment, the ring heavy on my finger and our daughter moving gently in my womb, I wanted desperately to believe him. But a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that in Gabriel's world, promises were fragile things, easily broken by forces beyond anyone's control. Still, as Gabriel began making plans for our wedding, his voice filled with excitement and hope, I chose to focus on the present moment. Whatever the future held, whatever dangers lurked in the shadows of Gabriel's empire, tonight, I was engaged to a man who loved me enough to fight for our life together. It would have to be enough. The wedding took place 5 days later in the private chapel of an exclusive hotel that Gabriel owned through a network of shell companies. It was a small ceremony, attended only by David and Elena Rossi, a handful of Gabriel's most trusted associates, and surprisingly, Frank from the diner, who Gabriel had personally invited after learning about his friendship with me. I wore a simple but elegant dress in cream silk that accommodated my growing belly, while still making me feel beautiful. Gabriel had arranged for a stylist to come to my apartment that morning, transforming my hair into an elegant updo, adorned with tiny white roses. When I caught sight of myself in the full-length mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. "You look radiant," Elena said, adjusting my short veil with practiced hands. "Like a woman who knows she's loved." Gabriel was waiting for me at the altar in a charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and dark coloring. When our eyes met across the chapel, his smile was so brilliant it took my breath away. Whatever doubts I'd harbored about the wisdom of this marriage seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of his obvious joy. The ceremony itself was brief, but meaningful. Gabriel had written his own vows, and when he spoke about promising to love and protect not just me, but our unborn daughter, there wasn't a dry eye in the chapel. My own vows were simpler but no less heartfelt. Promises to stand beside him through whatever came, to build a family together, despite the unconventional circumstances that had brought us to this moment. When the priest pronounced us husband and wife, Gabriel's kiss was tender and reverent, as if he were handling something infinitely precious. The small gathering erupted in applause, and for a moment, it was possible to forget about Vincent Castellano and the dangers that waited beyond the chapel doors. The reception was held in the hotel's private dining room, an intimate celebration with exceptional food and wine that cost more than most people spent on their entire weddings. Gabriel had arranged for a small orchestra to play during dinner, and when he led me onto the dance floor for our first dance as husband and wife, I felt like I was living in a fairy tale. "How do you feel, Mrs. Russo?" Gabriel murmured as we swayed to the music, his hand warm against the small of my back. Terrified, I admitted. Happy, but terrified. Good terrified, or bad terrified? I considered the question, thinking about the whirlwind of changes in my life over the past few months. Good terrified, I think. Like standing at the edge of a cliff and knowing you're about to fly. Gabriel's smile was soft with understanding. That's exactly how I felt the night you called to return my wallet. Like my life was about to change in ways I couldn't imagine. Any regrets? Only that I waited so long to ask you properly. His hand moved to rest gently on my belly, where our daughter was growing steadily. I should have known from the moment I saw you that you were meant to be mine. The possessiveness in his words should have alarmed me, but instead they sent a warm shiver down my spine. Over the past months, I'd come to understand that Gabriel's need to possess wasn't about control for its own sake. It was about cherishing what he valued most in the world. Frank approached us during the dinner, looking slightly out of place among Gabriel's associates, but carrying himself with quiet dignity. "Congratulations, Grace," he said, kissing my cheek gently. "You look beautiful." "Thank you for coming," I replied, squeezing his weathered hands. "It means the world to me that you're here." Frank nodded, then turned to Gabriel with an expression that was both respectful and assessing. "Take care of her, son. She's got a good heart." "I intend to," Gabriel replied seriously. "She's everything to me." As the evening wound down, Gabriel and I retreated to the hotel's penthouse suite, which had been transformed into a romantic haven with rose petals, candles, and champagne that I couldn't drink, but Gabriel insisted on having anyway. "For toasting our future," he said, filling his glass and raising it to mine, filled with sparkling cider. "To our future," I agreed, touching my glass to his. Our wedding night was gentle and passionate, Gabriel treating me with a reverence that made me feel cherished and desired. Afterward, as we lay tangled in the expensive sheets, he spoke softly about his plans for our life together. "I've been thinking about the nursery," he said, his hand tracing patterns on my bare shoulder. "There's a room in my penthouse that gets beautiful morning light. We could paint it yellow, since you want to be surprised about whether it's a boy or girl." "Actually," I said, smiling at his assumption, "I already know. The doctor told me at my last appointment. We're having a daughter." Gabriel went very still beside me. "A daughter? Are you disappointed?" "Disappointed?" Gabriel's laugh was filled with wonder. "Grace, I'm terrified. How am I supposed to protect a little girl in my world? How do I keep her safe while still letting her live?" I turned to face him, studying his expression in the candlelight. "The same way you've been protecting me, with love, with loyalty, and with the knowledge that some things are worth any risk." "I love you," Gabriel said suddenly, fiercely. "Both of you, more than I've ever loved anything in my life." "I love you too," I replied, meaning it completely. But even as we made plans and promises in our honeymoon suite, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were living in a bubble that would soon burst. Vincent Castellano was still out there, still a threat, and our marriage had likely only escalated the conflict between them. I was proven right 3 days after our wedding. I was at my follow-up appointment with Dr. Martinez, accompanied as always by Marcus and Tony, when Gabriel called with tension clear in his voice. "Where are you?" he asked without preamble. "At the doctor's office. Why?" "Stay there. Don't leave until I send additional security. Vincent made another move this morning." Fear clenched my stomach. "What kind of move?" "He hit 2 more of my businesses and sent a message. He knows about the wedding, Grace. He knows you're officially my wife now." "What does that mean?" Gabriel's silence was answer enough. Being his wife had made me an even more valuable target, not a safer one. "Gabriel? It means the game has changed," he said grimly. "And it means that what happens next is going to get ugly. I'm sorry, Grace. I thought we'd have more time." An hour later, I was escorted home by a security detail that had tripled in size. My beautiful apartment felt like a fortress, with armed men stationed at every entrance and exit. Gabriel arrived shortly after I did, his face grim with the kind of focused intensity I'd learned to recognize as his war face. "We need to talk," he said, leading me to the living room where David was waiting with several other men I didn't recognize. "Vincent sent this," David said, handing Gabriel a manila envelope. Gabriel opened it and removed several photographs, his expression growing darker with each image. Finally, he set them face down on the coffee table and looked at me with something that might have been regret. "He has surveillance photos of our wedding," Gabriel said quietly. "Of you leaving the hotel, entering this building, going to your doctor's appointments. He wants me to know that he can reach you whenever he chooses." The violation of having my most intimate moments captured and used as weapons made me feel sick. "What else?" "A demand," David said. "Gabriel returns everything Vincent claims was stolen from him, along with a substantial cash payment and withdrawal from certain territories. In exchange, Vincent agrees to leave you and the baby alone." "And if Gabriel refuses?" The silence that greeted my question was answer enough. "You're going to refuse, aren't you?" I said, looking at my husband of 3 days. "I can't give him what he's asking for," Gabriel said. "The information he wants would destroy dozens of innocent families, people who depend on me for their livelihoods, and the territories he's demanding control most of the legitimate businesses that support my organization. So you're choosing your empire over my safety." Gabriel's face went white. "I'm choosing to fight for everything we've built instead of handing it over to a man who will kill us both the moment he gets what he wants anyway." "You don't know that." "I know Vincent Castellano," Gabriel said harshly. "I know that he sees you as a symbol of my weakness, and symbols are only useful if they can be destroyed at the right moment for maximum impact." I stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the city. Down there, normal people were living normal lives, unaware that in a penthouse apartment across town, a woman was being used as a pawn in a war between powerful men. "What are you asking of me?" I said without turning around. "I'm asking you to trust me," Gabriel replied. "I'm asking you to believe that I can end this threat without surrendering everything we've worked for. And if you can't, then I'll make sure you and our daughter are safe, whatever the cost to myself." I turned to face him, studying the man I'd married, looking for any sign that he might be willing to compromise. Instead, I saw the cold determination of someone who'd made his choice and wouldn't be swayed from it. "When?" I asked. "Soon. David's making arrangements for you to be moved to a secure location outside the city, somewhere Vincent can't reach you while this plays out." "I don't want to leave you." Gabriel's expression softened slightly. "And I don't want you to go. But Grace, I can't fight Vincent and protect you at the same time. Not effectively. If I know you're safe, I can focus on ending this permanently. And if something happens to you while I'm gone, then you'll be wealthy, protected, and free to raise our daughter away from all this," Gabriel said, echoing the words he'd spoken when he proposed. "David has instructions to ensure you're taken care of, no matter what happens to me." The clinical way he discussed his potential death made my chest tight with panic. "Gabriel, this is how it has to be," he interrupted gently. "I wish there were another way, but Vincent's forced my hand. The only way to keep you safe is to remove you from the equation entirely." That night, I packed a bag with clothes for an extended stay away from the city, my hands shaking as I folded maternity clothes and gathered the prenatal vitamins that had become part of my daily routine. Gabriel watched from the doorway, his expression a mixture of love and anguish. "How long?" I asked. "I don't know. Weeks, maybe months, however long it takes." "Will you be able to contact me?" "It's better if I don't. Phone calls can be traced, messages intercepted. The safest thing is complete separation until this is over." The thought of being cut off from Gabriel entirely, of not knowing whether he was alive or dead while I waited in hiding, was almost unbearable. But I also understood the logic behind his decision. "Where will you send me?" "Somewhere Vincent will never think to look," Gabriel said. "David has a house in Montana, completely isolated. You'll be comfortable there, and there's a doctor in the nearest town who can handle the pregnancy. Montana, 1,000 miles away from everything I'd come to call home." "I'm scared," I admitted. Gabriel crossed the room and pulled me into his arms, holding me close enough that I could feel his heartbeat against my cheek. "So am I," he whispered. "But I'm more scared of what Vincent might do if you stay." "Promise me something," I said, pulling back to look into his dark eyes. "Anything. Promise me you'll come back to us. Whatever it takes, whatever you have to do, promise me you'll survive this and come back to us." Gabriel's hands cupped my face with infinite tenderness. "I promise, Grace. I'll come back to you and our daughter. We're going to have the life we planned, the family we dreamed of." As he kissed me with desperate passion, I tried to memorize everything about the moment. The feel of his hands in my hair, the scent of his cologne, the way he whispered my name like a prayer. Tomorrow I would be gone, hidden away while the man I loved fought a war that could destroy everything we'd built together. But tonight, I was still Grace Russo, wife to the most dangerous man in the city, carrying his daughter and believing in promises that might be impossible to keep. 3 months had passed since Gabriel sent me away to the isolated ranch in Montana, and I hadn't heard a word from him in all that time. The silence was the hardest part, not knowing if he was alive or dead, winning or losing the war with Vincent Castellano that had torn us apart. My only connection to the outside world was David's weekly calls to check on my health and the baby's progress, conversations that revealed nothing about Gabriel's situation, beyond the fact that he was still alive as of the last communication. The ranch house was beautiful and comfortable, situated on hundreds of acres of pristine wilderness with mountains rising in the distance like sleeping giants. David's caretaker, a weathered man named Jim, who asked no questions and volunteered no information, made sure I had everything I needed for my extended stay. But all the comfort in the world couldn't ease the aching loneliness or the constant worry that gnawed at me day and night. I was now 28 weeks pregnant, my daughter growing strong and active within me. The local doctor, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, assured me that everything was progressing normally, but she'd grown concerned about my stress levels and the way I'd withdrawn from all social interaction since arriving in Montana. "You need to prepare for the possibility that you might be raising this baby alone," she'd said gently during my most recent appointment. "Whatever situation your husband is dealing with back home, you can't put your life on hold indefinitely." But how could I prepare for a future without Gabriel when everything in me rebelled against the idea? Even in the darkest moments of doubt, I couldn't bring myself to believe he was truly gone. Surely I would feel it somehow, if the other half of my soul had been extinguished. It was a Tuesday evening in late November when everything changed. I was sitting by the fireplace reading one of the pregnancy books Gabriel had bought me months earlier, when I heard the sound of a car approaching the house. Jim had gone into town for supplies and wasn't expected back until the next day, which meant whoever was coming up the long gravel drive wasn't supposed to be there. Fear clenched my stomach as I moved to the window, peering through the curtains at the headlights cutting through the early winter darkness. A black SUV pulled up to the house, identical to the vehicles Gabriel's security team used. My heart raced with equal parts hope and terror as the doors opened and several figures emerged. The first man I recognized immediately, Marcus, the guard who'd protected me for months in the city. Behind him came 2 other men I didn't know, but their posture and alertness marked them clearly as Gabriel's people. And finally, stepping out of the passenger seat with the fluid grace I'd memorized, was Gabriel himself. I stood frozen at the window, afraid to believe what I was seeing. Gabriel looked thinner than when I'd last seen him, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that might have been grief. But he was alive. He was here, and he was walking toward the house with the determined stride of a man who'd come to reclaim what belonged to him. I was at the door before he could knock, pulling it open with shaking hands. For a moment, we simply stared at each other across the threshold, taking in the changes that 3 months of separation had wrought. Gabriel's eyes went immediately to my significantly expanded belly, then back to my face with an expression of wonder and longing. "Grace," he said, my name a prayer on his lips. "You came back," I whispered, hardly daring to believe it was real. I promised I would. I threw myself into his arms without another thought, feeling his familiar strength and warmth as he held me tight against him. He was real, solid, alive. Whatever had happened in the city, whatever battles he'd fought and won or lost, he'd kept his promise to return to us. "Is it over?" I asked against his shoulder. "It's over," Gabriel confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "Vincent is dead. The threat is gone." Relief washed through me so powerfully that my knees nearly buckled. Gabriel caught me immediately, his arms tightening around me as he guided me back into the house and settled me carefully on the sofa. "Tell me what happened," I said, once I'd caught my breath. Gabriel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from our early days together. "It's not a pretty story, Grace." "I don't need pretty. I need to know." Gabriel was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire that crackled in the stone hearth. When he spoke, his voice was controlled but haunted. Vincent had been planning his move for months, building alliances with families from Chicago and Boston. He thought he could eliminate me and take over my territory with outside support. What he didn't count on was the loyalty of my people, the relationships I'd built over the years. "What did you do?" "What I had to do," Gabriel said simply. "I offered evidence of Vincent's dealings with federal prosecutors in exchange for immunity from certain charges. Turned out the FBI had been looking for a way to bring him down for years, and I gave them what they needed." I stared at him, processing the implications. "You worked with the federal government?" "I made a deal that neutralized the threat to our family while cleaning up certain aspects of my business." Gabriel's dark eyes met mine steadily. "I won't lie to you, Grace. Not all of my operations were legal, but the ones that weren't are finished now. Everything I do going forward will be completely legitimate." "And Vincent," Gabriel's expression hardened, "tried to run when he realized what was happening. Died in a shootout with federal agents 3 days ago." The simple words carried the weight of months of planning and maneuvering, of a war fought in shadows and boardrooms rather than with guns in the street. Gabriel had outplayed his enemy using intelligence and strategy rather than violence, but the result was the same. Vincent Castellano was dead, and we were free. "How long have you known it was over?" I asked. "A week. I wanted to make sure there were no loose ends, no remaining threats, before I came for you." "You could have called." Gabriel reached for my hands, intertwining our fingers. "I needed to see you, to touch you, to know that you were really safe. A phone call wouldn't have been enough." I studied his face, noting the new lines around his eyes, the tension that still lingered in his shoulders. "What aren't you telling me?" Gabriel sighed, a sound heavy with exhaustion. "The cleanup required sacrifices. I had to give up relationships, territories, revenue streams that had been part of my family's legacy for decades. Some of my father's oldest associates feel I betrayed everything he built." "Do you regret it?" "No," Gabriel said without hesitation. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat. You and our daughter are worth more than any empire." Our daughter. The baby chose that moment to kick strongly, as if responding to her father's voice. Gabriel's eyes widened as he saw the movement beneath my sweater. "May I?" he asked, his hands hovering over my belly. I guided his hands to the spot where she was most active, watching his face transform with wonder as he felt his daughter's movements for the first time in months. "She's grown so much," he marveled. "She missed you," I said softly. We both did. Gabriel leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to my belly, speaking in Italian words I didn't understand, but that sounded like promises and endearments. When he looked up at me again, there were tears in his dark eyes. "I miss so much," he said. "Appointments, milestones, feeling her grow stronger." "You're here now," I interrupted. "That's what matters." "Come home with me," Gabriel said suddenly. "Tonight. I've spent 3 months in a world without you, and I can't do it anymore." "Gabriel, I know it's sudden, and I know you've built a life here, but Grace, I need you. I need to wake up with you in my arms and fall asleep knowing you're safe beside me. I need to be part of this pregnancy, part of preparing for our daughter's arrival." I looked around the ranch house that had been my sanctuary for 3 months, then back at my husband's face. He looked like a man who'd fought impossible odds and emerged victorious but scarred. The empire he'd inherited was smaller now, cleaner but diminished. His enemies were dead, but so were some of his oldest alliances. "What kind of life are you offering me?" I asked. "What does our future look like now?" Gabriel was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. Simpler than before, but possibly more complicated in other ways. The legitimate businesses are thriving, and without the shadow operations, we'll have resources and energy to focus on building something sustainable. But there will always be people who remember what I used to be, who might try to use that against us. And our daughter? We'll grow up knowing she's loved and protected, but also knowing that her father made choices in the past that she might not understand or approve of. Gabriel's voice was steady but sad. "I can't change my history, Grace. I can only promise that her future will be different." I placed my hands over his where they rested on my belly, feeling our daughter's gentle movements beneath our joined palms. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together as a family. "When do we leave?" I asked. Gabriel's smile was radiant. "Tomorrow, if you're up for traveling. I've already made arrangements with Dr. Mitchell to transfer your care back to Dr. Martinez in the city." "You were that confident I'd say yes?" "I was that hopeful," Gabriel corrected. "But if you'd needed more time, I would have stayed here as long as necessary to convince you." That night, Gabriel held me as I slept, his hands resting protectively on my belly where our daughter grew. I woke several times to find him watching me with an expression of such tender devotion that it took my breath away. Whatever he'd endured during our separation, whatever prices he'd paid to secure our freedom, he'd emerged from the ordeal more committed than ever to the life we were building together. The next morning, we said goodbye to the Montana ranch and began the journey back to the city. As we flew over the landscape that had sheltered me during the darkest months of my life, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the sanctuary it had provided. But I was ready to return to my real life, the one that included Gabriel and the future we'd planned together. "Are you nervous about going back?" Gabriel asked as the city skyline came into view. "A little," I admitted. "Everything's changed." "The important things haven't," Gabriel said, taking my hand. "We're still married, still having a daughter together, still building a family. The rest is just details." But as our plane descended toward the airport, I couldn't shake the feeling that those details might prove more significant than Gabriel anticipated. We were returning to a world where everyone would know that Gabriel Russo had chosen love over power, family over empire. Some would respect that choice, but others might see it as weakness to be exploited. Only time would tell whether the life Gabriel had fought so hard to preserve would prove worth the prices we'd both paid for it. But as he squeezed my hand and smiled at me with the same intense devotion I remembered from our wedding day, I chose to believe in the promise of our future together. We were going home, and whatever came next, we would face it as a family.